Good evening, and welcome back. Tonight's story begins in the bright and busy emergency room of a hospital in Riverside on an evening in February of 1994. It was an ordinary night at first. Doctors moved quickly between patients. Nurses checked charts and monitors. The sounds of telephones, footsteps, and quiet conversations filled the halls. Then a woman was brought into the emergency department. Her name was Gloria Ramirez. She was 31 years old and seriously ill. The medical staff immediately began trying to help her, but within minutes, something strange began to happen. Several members of the hospital staff noticed an unusual smell in the room. Some described it as chemical or sweet. Others later said it reminded them of garlic or ammonia. Soon after, people began to feel unwell. A nurse felt dizzy and fainted. Another complained of nausea. One doctor became lightheaded. Then more staff members began collapsing around the patient. The emergency room, normally a place of calm order during a crisis, became a scene of confusion and alarm. By the end of the night, more than 20 hospital workers had reported symptoms. Several had to be treated themselves. Some became so ill that they required hospitalization. No one could immediately explain why. In the days that followed, the story spread quickly. Newspapers and television reports described a mysterious woman whose presence seemed to have caused a wave of illness inside the hospital. Before long, Gloria Ramirez became known by a strange and unsettling nickname, the Toxic Lady. What happened that night has never been fully agreed upon. Some people believe there was a rare chemical reaction involving medication that Gloria had been using. Others believe the hospital staff may have been affected by fear, stress, or the power of suggestion. Even now, decades later, there is no explanation that satisfies everyone. As always, if you enjoy these calm and carefully told mysteries, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel. It helps support more long-form documentaries designed for quiet evenings and restful listening. Now, settle in. Allow the day to slowly drift away, and let us return to that hospital room in Riverside, where one ordinary night became one of the strangest medical mysteries in modern history. On the evening of February 19th, 1994, the emergency department at Riverside General Hospital was busy but calm. Doctors and nurses were moving through the department in the usual way, treating patients, checking charts, and preparing for the rest of the night. Nothing seemed unusual, and no one working there could have guessed that the next few hours would become part of one of the strangest medical mysteries in modern history. At around 8:15 in the evening, paramedics arrived with a new patient. The woman was 31-year-old Gloria Ramirez. She had been brought from her home in Riverside after becoming seriously ill. According to reports, Gloria was suffering from advanced cervical cancer and had been dealing with the effects of the illness for some time. That night, however, her condition had become much worse. When Gloria arrived at the hospital, she was confused, disoriented, and struggling to breathe. Her heart was racing, and her blood pressure was dangerously unstable. Witnesses later said that she appeared frightened and uncomfortable, and that she was unable to answer questions clearly. Because of the seriousness of her condition, the medical team immediately began emergency treatment. Several nurses and doctors gathered around Gloria's bed. They removed her clothing, attached monitors, and prepared medication. A blood sample was taken so that the staff could better understand what was happening inside her body. At first, everything followed the normal pattern of emergency medicine. Then, as one nurse began drawing blood from Gloria's arm, something unusual caught her attention. The nurse later reported that she noticed a strange smell coming from the blood sample. Different people described the odor in different ways. Some said it smelled faintly like garlic. Others said it reminded them of ammonia or a strong chemical cleaner. The smell was unusual enough that several members of staff in the room noticed it immediately. At nearly the same moment, another nurse observed something even stranger. Floating in the blood sample, she thought she could see tiny pale yellow particles. They seemed oily or crystalline, and they did not look like anything she expected to find in an ordinary blood sample. The room became briefly quiet as the staff looked more closely, although the strange odor and unusual appearance of the blood were concerning. The doctors continued trying to save Gloria's life. She was critically ill, and there was little time to stop and investigate. As the treatment continued, however, the people standing closest to Gloria began to feel unwell. One nurse complained that she felt lightheaded and nauseated. Another suddenly became dizzy and had to step away from the bed. A respiratory therapist reported feeling faint. Within moments, one of the nurses collapsed to the floor. At first, some of the staff believed the nurse may simply have been overwhelmed by the stress of the situation. Emergency rooms are intense places, and people sometimes become faint during difficult cases. But then another member of staff became ill. Then another. Very quickly, it became clear that something unusual was happening inside the room. The attention of the doctors and nurses slowly shifted from Gloria Ramirez herself to the growing number of hospital workers who were suddenly unable to stand. What had begun as an ordinary emergency had become something far stranger, and no one yet understood why. As more members of staff gathered around the bed of Gloria Ramirez, the atmosphere inside the emergency room began to change. Only minutes earlier, the room had been focused on saving a seriously ill patient. Now, doctors and nurses were beginning to notice that something seemed wrong with the people treating her. The first person to become seriously unwell was a nurse named Susan Kane. After noticing the unusual smell coming from Gloria's blood sample, Kane suddenly began to feel dizzy. She later said that her head felt light and that she became nauseated almost immediately. At first, she tried to continue working. Emergency room staff are trained to remain calm under pressure, and it was not unusual for people to occasionally feel faint during stressful situations. But within moments, Susan Kane collapsed. Other staff members rushed to help her and carried her out of the room. As they did, another nurse began to complain of symptoms. Julie Gorky later reported that she felt a sudden tightness in her chest and an intense wave of nausea. She said that the smell in the room seemed stronger than before and that she began to shake uncontrollably. Shortly afterward, Gorky also fainted. The room, which had already been crowded, became increasingly chaotic. Some staff continued trying to save Gloria Ramirez, while others attempted to help the nurses who had collapsed. Several doctors later said that they had never experienced anything like it. One physician described feeling dizzy and disoriented while standing near Gloria's bed. Another reported a burning sensation in the face and throat. As the minutes passed, the symptoms became more varied. Some members of staff experienced nausea, headaches, and dizziness. Others complained of shortness of breath or irritation in the eyes. A few described feeling weak in their arms and legs. The symptoms appeared to spread most strongly among the people who had been standing closest to Gloria Ramirez. Nurses who had handled the blood sample or spent the most time near the bed seemed to become ill first. This detail made the situation even more frightening. Several staff members later said that the strange smell remained in the room the entire time. Some described it as sweet and unpleasant. Others compared it to the scent of chemicals or strong medicine. One doctor later recalled that the room no longer felt like an ordinary hospital room. Instead, it seemed as though the air itself had changed. By this point, there was no longer any doubt that something unusual was happening. The emergency department staff began to fear that there might be a dangerous chemical or toxic substance somewhere in the room. The possibility that Gloria herself might somehow be connected to the illness became impossible to ignore. Yet no one knew how this could be possible. Gloria Ramirez had arrived at the hospital as a patient, not as someone exposed to dangerous chemicals. There was no obvious sign of poison, gas, or contamination. Even so, more staff members continued to become unwell. Within a short time, the emergency room had become a scene of confusion. Doctors who were supposed to be helping Gloria now found themselves helping one another. Some people hurried out of the room to get fresh air. Others remained behind, uncertain whether they should continue treatment. Meanwhile, Gloria Ramirez lay silently in the center of the room as the mystery around her deepened. By the end of the night, more than 20 members of staff would report symptoms. Several would require medical treatment of their own, and the hospital would soon make an extraordinary decision that reflected just how serious the situation had become. As the strange symptoms spread through the emergency department at Riverside General Hospital, the situation became increasingly alarming. What had first appeared to be an isolated reaction affecting 1 or 2 nurses was now beginning to involve a growing number of people. Several members of staff who had been standing near Gloria Ramirez reported dizziness, nausea, and difficulty breathing. A few tried to leave the room and continue working elsewhere in the hospital, but the symptoms did not disappear immediately. One nurse later recalled that her legs suddenly felt weak beneath her. Another described a heavy pressure in the chest and a strange metallic taste in the mouth. Several people said that they felt as though they might lose consciousness. Before long, some of them did. Among the most seriously affected was Julie Gorky. After collapsing in the emergency room, she continued to experience severe symptoms. Witnesses later said that Gorky was shaking uncontrollably and that her breathing had become dangerously difficult. She was eventually admitted to the hospital herself and later spent time in intensive care. Another hospital worker fainted after assisting with Gloria's treatment. One respiratory therapist later reported feeling so weak that it became difficult to stand. A doctor who had been near Gloria's bed developed a severe headache and burning in the skin. The growing number of illnesses created an atmosphere of fear throughout the department. Nurses who had not been in the room began hearing that something dangerous might be spreading through the hospital. At first, no one knew what to believe. Some staff worried that there had been a chemical spill. Others wondered if Gloria Ramirez had been exposed to some unknown toxic substance before arriving at the hospital. Because there was no clear explanation, rumors spread quickly. People working in nearby areas of the hospital began to notice the confusion. They saw staff being carried out of the emergency room, heard reports of people collapsing, and watched as nurses and doctors hurried through the corridors, looking frightened and uncertain. Inside the room, however, treatment for Gloria Ramirez continued. Despite the growing concern, a small number of doctors and nurses remained near her bed and continued trying to save her life. They understood that Gloria was critically ill and that there was still a chance to help her. Those who stayed behind later said that the decision was difficult. By now, it was obvious that something unusual was affecting the people around Gloria. Yet there was no time to stop and fully understand what it was. As the emergency team continued working, the atmosphere in the room became increasingly tense. Staff members wore masks and gloves, but there was little confidence that these would protect them if a dangerous chemical was somehow present. Eventually, several workers decided that the room had become unsafe. One by one, people began leaving. Some walked out on their own, while others were helped away because they felt too ill to continue. In the middle of the confusion, Gloria Ramirez remained on the bed, surrounded by only a small group of medical staff. Later, witnesses described the scene as deeply unsettling. The emergency room, usually a place where patients were cared for by a large and organized team, had become nearly empty. Doctors and nurses had become patients themselves. By the end of the incident, more than 23 hospital workers had reported symptoms. 5 required hospitalization, and at least 1 spent several weeks recovering. No one had ever seen anything quite like it. The question now facing the hospital was simple but frightening. What exactly had caused so many trained medical professionals to collapse around a single patient? By the time several doctors and nurses had collapsed, the staff at Riverside General Hospital realized that the situation could no longer be treated as an ordinary medical emergency. Too many people had become ill, and no one understood why. The possibility that some kind of dangerous chemical or gas might be present in the emergency room now seemed impossible to ignore. Hospital administrators and senior medical staff were called to the department. After speaking with the nurses and doctors who had been affected, they made a decision that would have seemed almost unimaginable only an hour earlier. The emergency room would be evacuated. Patients who were able to move were quickly transferred to other parts of the hospital. Those in more serious condition were moved with the help of staff who had not yet entered the contaminated area. At the same time, many of the hospital workers who had been near Gloria Ramirez were escorted outside the building or to other sections of the hospital for treatment. Witnesses later described a scene of growing confusion. People hurried through the corridors wearing masks and gloves. Stretchers moved quickly past waiting rooms and nursing stations. Doctors spoke quietly but urgently to one another, trying to understand what had happened. Inside the emergency department, only a very small number of staff remained. These doctors and nurses were asked to continue working with Gloria Ramirez while wearing additional protective clothing. Some put on gowns, masks, and rubber gloves. Others tried to cover their faces more completely. Even with these precautions, many of them remained frightened. The room itself was now being treated almost as though it were the site of a chemical accident. Doors were closed, and people were told to stay away. Some hospital workers feared that whatever had caused the illness might spread through the building. At one point, there was concern that the air conditioning system might carry a dangerous substance into other parts of the hospital. Fortunately, there was no sign that this had happened. Outside the emergency room, several of the affected staff members continued to receive treatment. Some were given oxygen. Others were examined for signs of poisoning or exposure to chemicals. Julie Gorky, who had been among the first to collapse, remained one of the most seriously affected. She continued to experience breathing difficulties and shaking, and she would later require intensive care. As the evacuation continued, Gloria Ramirez herself remained in the emergency room. Despite every effort made by the remaining staff, her condition continued to worsen. Doctors attempted resuscitation and other emergency procedures, but nothing seemed to help. A little after 8:50 in the evening, Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. Even after her death, however, the mystery did not end. In fact, it became even more disturbing, because so many members of staff had become ill. The hospital feared that Gloria's body itself might somehow be dangerous. Officials decided that no one should approach the body until more was known. For several hours, Gloria Ramirez remained alone in the emergency room while experts were contacted. Eventually, a special team wearing protective suits arrived to move the body. Later, even the coroner's office would take unusual precautions. Gloria's body would be placed inside a sealed aluminum coffin because officials feared that whatever had caused the incident might still be present. The evacuation of the emergency department marked the moment when the story moved beyond a strange medical event and became a true mystery. A woman had entered the hospital seeking help. Less than an hour later, she was dead. The emergency room had been emptied, and more than 20 members of staff had become ill. No one yet knew what had happened, and the search for answers was only beginning. After the confusion and fear of that night at Riverside General Hospital, attention slowly turned toward the woman at the center of the mystery. Before she became known in newspapers and television reports as the Toxic Lady, Gloria Ramirez had been an ordinary person living in Riverside, California. Gloria was born in 1963 and was 31 years old at the time of her death. She lived with her family and had spent much of her adult life in Riverside. Friends and relatives later described her as quiet, caring, and deeply devoted to the people around her. In the months before her death, Gloria had been facing a serious illness. She had been diagnosed with advanced cervical cancer, and by early 1990, her condition had become very severe. Family members later explained that Gloria had been receiving treatment and trying to manage her illness at home. Like many people living with chronic pain and serious disease, she was searching for anything that might help her feel better, according to those who knew her. Gloria had recently been using a substance called dimethyl sulfoxide, often shortened to DM. Dimethyl sulfoxide is a clear liquid that has sometimes been used as a home remedy for pain. It was especially popular in the United States during the 1970s and 1980s, although doctors often warned against using it without medical advice. Some people believed that DMSO could reduce pain and swelling when rubbed onto the skin. Gloria's family later said that she had been applying it to her body in an attempt to relieve the discomfort caused by cancer. At the time, no one imagined that this detail might become important. In the days after Gloria's death, investigators began examining every possible clue. They spoke to family members, reviewed her medical history, and searched for anything unusual that might explain why the hospital staff had become ill. The mention of DMSO immediately attracted attention. The chemical itself was not considered especially dangerous under normal conditions. However, investigators wondered whether it might somehow have changed after being absorbed into Gloria's body. This theory became even more interesting because of the unusual smell reported by the nurses and doctors. Many people who have used DMSO say that it can produce a faint odor similar to garlic or sulfur. That detail seemed to match what several hospital workers had described in the emergency room. At the same time, there were many questions that remained unanswered. No one knew exactly how much DMSO Gloria had used, when she had used it, or whether it could really explain the symptoms experienced by more than 20 hospital workers. Her family also strongly objected to the idea that Gloria herself had somehow poisoned the people around her. They felt that the attention given to the chemical theory was unfair and made it seem as though Gloria had been responsible for what happened. To those who knew her, Gloria Ramirez was not a mystery or a headline. She was a daughter, a mother, and a woman who had been suffering from a terrible illness. In interviews after her death, family members spoke about their sadness and frustration. They believed that too much attention was being given to strange theories and not enough to the fact that Gloria had lost her life. The mystery surrounding her death would continue for years. Yet behind every theory and every newspaper story was the life of a real person whose final hours became part of one of the strangest events ever recorded inside a hospital. In the hours after the death of Gloria Ramirez, the atmosphere at Riverside General Hospital remained tense and uncertain. More than 20 members of staff had reported symptoms. Several had required treatment, and no one knew what had caused the strange events in the emergency room. Almost immediately, local health officials and investigators were called to the hospital. The possibility that a dangerous chemical had somehow entered the emergency department could not be ignored. The first task was to determine whether the hospital itself had been contaminated. Investigators checked the room where Gloria had been treated, examined the equipment used that night, and searched for any sign of a spilled substance or leaking gas. Nothing unusual was found. The monitors, medical instruments, and oxygen equipment all appeared to be working normally. No damaged containers or broken chemical bottles were discovered anywhere in the room. This only deepened the confusion. Because there was no obvious source inside the hospital, investigators began to focus on Gloria Ramirez herself. They wanted to know whether she had been exposed to something unusual before arriving at the emergency room. Doctors reviewed her medical records and spoke with paramedics who had brought her to the hospital. Family members were also questioned about her illness, her medications, and anything she may have used at home. At first, the information seemed contradictory. Some witnesses insisted that the smell in the room had been very strong. Others said it had only been faint. Several members of staff described Gloria's blood as containing strange yellow particles, while others said they saw nothing unusual at all. There were also differences in the symptoms reported by the hospital workers. Some people experienced nausea and dizziness. Others complained of breathing problems or burning in the skin. because the symptoms varied so much. Investigators found it difficult to determine whether everyone had been affected by the same thing. The uncertainty created growing frustration. Within a day, local authorities contacted specialists from the California Department of Health Services. Experts in toxicology and hazardous materials were brought in to examine the evidence. At the same time, the coroner faced an unusual problem. Because of fears that Gloria's body might still be dangerous, the normal autopsy process was delayed. Officials worried that if some unknown chemical was present, anyone handling the body might also become ill. Eventually, Gloria's body was moved to a special room and examined using extra protective equipment. Workers wore masks, gloves, and protective suits. The body itself remained inside a sealed container for much of the investigation. The extreme precautions attracted media attention almost immediately. Newspapers began reporting that a mysterious woman had entered a hospital and caused nurses and doctors to collapse. Rumors spread quickly through Riverside and beyond. Some people wondered if Gloria had been poisoned. Others believed she may have been exposed to an unknown chemical at work or at home. A few even suggested far stranger explanations. Inside the hospital, however, there was still no clear answer. As the investigation continued, one fact remained especially difficult to explain. Most of the people who became ill had been standing closest to Gloria Ramirez. Those who had spent the most time near her bed, or who had handled her blood, had experienced the strongest symptoms. That detail convinced many investigators that Gloria herself somehow held the key to the mystery. Yet exactly how that could be possible remained unclear. The more officials searched for an answer, the more confusing the story seemed to become. As investigators continued searching for an explanation, attention increasingly focused on the substance that Gloria Ramirez may have been using at home. Family members had mentioned that she sometimes applied dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, to her skin to help relieve the pain caused by advanced cancer. At first, this detail seemed unimportant. DMSO had been used for years as a home remedy, and although doctors often discouraged it, it was not generally considered highly dangerous. However, the unusual smell reported in the emergency room seemed to match one of the known effects of DMSO. People who use the substance often describe a strong odor that can resemble garlic, sulfur, or chemicals. This immediately caught the attention of investigators, because several nurses and doctors had described exactly that kind of smell coming from Gloria Ramirez and from the blood sample taken that night. The leading theory was developed by experts from the California Department of Health Services. According to their report, Gloria may have applied a large amount of DMSO to her skin before arriving at the hospital, because she was seriously ill and receiving oxygen. The investigators believed that the chemical inside her body may have changed into something much more dangerous. The theory suggested that the DMSO had first been converted into another chemical called dimethyl sulfone. The pale yellow particles seen in Gloria's blood sample were thought to possibly be small crystals of this substance. Then, according to the report, the electrical shocks and oxygen treatment used during the emergency may have caused the dimethyl sulfone to change again. The final result, investigators believed, may have been a rare and highly toxic gas called dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an extremely dangerous chemical that can cause nausea, dizziness, breathing problems, and fainting. The symptoms reported by the hospital staff seemed to fit this explanation surprisingly well. According to the official theory, the toxic gas may have formed around Gloria's body and spread into the air of the emergency room. The people standing closest to her would have breathed in the greatest amount, which might explain why the nurses and doctors nearest the bed became ill first and most severely. For a time, this explanation appeared to solve the mystery. The strange smell, the unusual particles in the blood, and the pattern of illness among the staff all seemed to fit together. Newspapers quickly repeated the theory, and before long, Gloria Ramirez became known across the country as the Toxic Lady. Yet even as the story spread, many scientists and medical experts remained uncertain. The chemical reaction described in the report was extremely unusual, and some experts argued that it should not have been possible under the conditions inside the hospital room. Others pointed out that no actual dimethyl sulfate was ever found or measured. This meant that the entire explanation depended on a chain of events that had never been directly proven. The investigators believed it was possible, but they could not say with complete certainty that it had truly happened. As a result, the theory of the toxic lady became both the most famous explanation and one of the most debated. For some people, it remains the most convincing answer to the mystery. For others, it is only one more possibility in a story that has never been fully understood. Although the theory involving DMSO and dimethyl sulfate became the most widely known explanation, it was far from universally accepted. In the months after the death of Gloria Ramirez, many doctors, chemists, and researchers questioned whether such a reaction could really have taken place inside the emergency room. One of the strongest criticisms came from scientists who argued that the conditions in the hospital were not suitable for producing dimethyl sulfate. According to the official theory, several unusual chemical changes would have needed to occur in a very short time. Critics pointed out that these reactions normally require specific temperatures, laboratory conditions, or industrial processes. To them, it seemed unlikely that such a dangerous chemical could have formed naturally inside Gloria's body. Several chemists also noted that dimethyl sulfate is extremely hazardous. If enough of it had been present to make more than 20 people ill, they argued, the effects should have been much more severe. Some experts believed that the doctors and nurses standing closest to Gloria would likely have suffered far more serious injuries if they had truly been exposed to a toxic gas of that kind. Because of these doubts, alternative explanations began to appear. One theory suggested that the symptoms experienced by the hospital staff may have been caused by stress and fear rather than by a chemical. This idea became known as mass psychogenic illness, sometimes called mass hysteria. Mass psychogenic illness can occur when people in a stressful environment begin experiencing physical symptoms because they believe they have been exposed to danger. The symptoms are real, but they are caused by anxiety and suggestion rather than by a toxin or disease. Supporters of this explanation pointed out that emergency rooms are intense and emotionally difficult places. The staff at Riverside General Hospital were already dealing with a critically ill patient, unusual smells, and the shock of seeing their colleagues become sick. Once one nurse fainted, others may have become frightened and more aware of every sensation in their own bodies. Feelings of stress, dizziness, and nausea can spread quickly in situations like this. There was some evidence that supported this theory. Most of the people who became ill were women, and many of them were younger members of staff. Several of the workers who reported symptoms had not actually been standing very close to Gloria Ramirez. At the same time, some of the people who had spent the longest time near Gloria never became ill at all. To supporters of the psychogenic explanation, this suggested that the pattern of illness did not fit a chemical exposure as neatly as it first appeared. However, others strongly disagreed. Many of the staff who became sick insisted that what they experienced felt far more serious than simple anxiety. Some people had symptoms that lasted for days or even weeks. Julie Gorky, for example, required intensive care and later said that she suffered lasting effects after the incident. It seemed difficult to explain such serious illness through stress alone. There were also the strange details that continued to trouble investigators. The unusual smell, the yellow particles in Gloria's blood, and the fact that so many people became sick in such a short time all remained difficult to ignore. As a result, the debate continued. Some experts believed that a rare chemical reaction had taken place. Others believed that the staff had unintentionally frightened one another into becoming ill. A few suggested that perhaps both explanations were partly true. It is possible that an unusual odor or chemical was present in the room, causing mild symptoms at first. Then, as fear spread among the staff, though symptoms may have become much stronger. Even today, there is no agreement. The mystery of Gloria Ramirez remains one of those rare cases where every explanation seems possible, but none seems complete. Once the story of Gloria Ramirez reached the newspapers, it spread quickly across the United States. What had begun as a strange and confusing night inside a hospital in Riverside soon became a national story. The idea itself seemed almost impossible to believe. A woman had arrived at a hospital seeking help, and then doctors and nurses around her had begun collapsing. The emergency room had been evacuated, and no one could explain exactly why. For newspapers and television reporters, it was the kind of story that immediately attracted attention. Within days, Gloria Ramirez was being referred to by a new name. Journalists began calling her the Toxic Lady. The nickname appeared in newspapers across the country and soon became the phrase most people associated with the case. Although the name made the story easier to remember, Gloria's family felt uncomfortable with it. They believed it reduced Gloria to a mystery and ignored the fact that she had been a real person suffering from a serious illness. At the same time, the media coverage became increasingly dramatic. Some newspapers described Gloria as though she had somehow poisoned the hospital. Others suggested that she had been carrying an unknown chemical or disease. Headlines often emphasized the strange smell, the yellow crystals in her blood, and the collapse of the hospital workers. Television reports frequently showed images of ambulances, hospital corridors, and doctors wearing protective clothing. The more unusual details of the story were repeated again and again. As often happens with mysterious events, public fear grew quickly. People in Riverside began wondering whether there might be some hidden danger connected to Gloria Ramirez. Rumors spread through the city. Some people believed there had been a secret chemical leak. Others thought the hospital was hiding information. A few even suggested far stranger ideas. Because the official explanation was still unclear, many people began inventing their own theories. Some believed Gloria had been exposed to a dangerous industrial chemical before arriving at the hospital. Others wondered whether she had accidentally poisoned herself with medicine or home remedies. There were also more sensational stories. A small number of people claimed that the case involved government experiments or unknown substances that authorities did not want to discuss publicly. None of these theories was ever supported by evidence, but they continued to spread because the story itself felt so unusual. The mystery also appeared on television programs, magazine articles, and later on documentaries about unexplained events. Each new retelling added another layer to the story. Over time, Gloria Ramirez became less well known as a woman from Riverside, and more well known as a symbol of an unsolved mystery. For Gloria's family, this was painful. They repeatedly spoke to reporters and insisted that Gloria should be remembered as a daughter and a mother, not simply as the Toxic Lady. They felt that too much attention had been given to frightening theories and not enough to Gloria herself. Even so, the strange details of the case continued to fascinate people. The image of an emergency room suddenly filling with frightened doctors and collapsing nurses was difficult to forget. The fact that no one could agree on what had happened only made the story more powerful. Years later, the mystery still appears in lists of unexplained medical cases and strange historical events. The media reaction helped transform a tragic night in one California hospital into a story known around the world. In the months following the death of Gloria Ramirez, investigators from the California Department of Health Services continued studying every detail of what had happened at Riverside General Hospital. They interviewed hospital staff, reviewed medical records, examined laboratory results, and consulted chemists and toxicologists. The investigation lasted for many weeks because the case was so unusual. Officials wanted to understand not only why Gloria had died, but also why more than 20 hospital workers had suddenly become ill while treating her. Eventually, the California Department of Health Services released its official conclusion. According to the report, Gloria Ramirez had likely been using dimethyl sulfoxide, or DMSO, on her skin before arriving at the hospital, because she was receiving oxygen and emergency treatment. The investigators believed that the DMSO inside her body may have been converted into a far more dangerous substance. The report suggested that the DMSO first became dimethyl sulfone, which may have appeared as the pale yellow crystals seen in Gloria's blood sample. Then, during the emergency procedures in the hospital room, the dimethyl sulfone may have changed into dimethyl sulfate, a highly toxic chemical. Investigators believed that small amounts of this chemical may have escaped into the air around Gloria Ramirez. The people standing closest to her would have been exposed first, which matched the pattern of illness seen in the emergency room. The staff nearest to Gloria had reported the strongest symptoms, while those farther away often remained unaffected. The official report also explained why some staff may have become more ill than others. Differences in distance, time spent near Gloria, and individual sensitivity to chemicals could all have influenced the severity of the symptoms. According to the investigators, this theory was the best explanation for the strange smell, the unusual appearance of Gloria's blood, and the sudden collapse of doctors and nurses in the room. At the same time, the report admitted that there were limits to what could be proven. No sample of dimethyl sulfate was ever collected from the hospital room. By the time the investigation began, the emergency department had been cleaned, the air had changed, and much of the evidence had disappeared. Because of this, the official explanation remained partly theoretical. The investigators believed it was the most likely answer, but they could not demonstrate beyond all doubt that the chemical reaction had actually occurred. The report also acknowledged that fear and stress may have played some role in the incident. Once the first nurses became ill, the rest of the staff may have become more aware of their own symptoms and more frightened by what was happening. This did not necessarily mean that the entire event was caused by anxiety. Instead, the investigators suggested that a real chemical exposure may have been made worse by the growing panic inside the emergency room. For the California Department of Health Services, the case was considered closed after the report was released. Officials believed they had identified the most likely explanation and saw no reason to continue the investigation. Not everyone agreed. Some chemists continued to argue that the proposed chemical reaction was impossible. Others believed that the report relied too heavily on assumptions and not enough on evidence. Gloria Ramirez's family also rejected the conclusion. They believed that the official explanation unfairly suggested that Gloria herself had somehow caused the illness of the hospital staff. To them, the report did not answer the mystery. It simply replaced one uncertainty with another. Even so, the official investigation remains the closest thing the case has to an answer. More than 30 years later, the report from California health officials is still the explanation most often repeated whenever people speak about the strange and tragic death of Gloria Ramirez. More than 30 years after the death of Gloria Ramirez, the case still remains one of the strangest and most debated medical mysteries in modern history. At first glance, it may seem that the official investigation provided an answer. The report from the California Department of Health Services offered a detailed theory involving DMSO, dimethyl sulfone, and dimethyl sulfate. For many people, this explanation appears reasonable because it seems to connect the strange smell, the yellow particles in Gloria's blood, and the sudden illness of the hospital staff. Yet the mystery has never truly disappeared because the explanation leaves so many questions behind. The greatest problem is that the official theory was never directly proven. No sample of dimethyl sulfate was ever found in the emergency room. No test ever confirmed that the gas had actually been present. Instead, investigators created a theory based on what might have happened. The explanation depended on several unusual chemical reactions taking place in exactly the right order. To some scientists, that chain of events still seems too unlikely. Many chemists continue to argue that the conditions inside the hospital room were not suitable for producing dimethyl sulfate. They believe that the temperatures, equipment, and medical procedures used that night should not have been able to create such a dangerous chemical. If they are correct, then the official explanation cannot fully solve the mystery. At the same time, the theory of mass psychogenic illness also leaves important questions unanswered. It is possible that fear and anxiety influenced the hospital staff after the first nurse became ill. People often become more aware of their own bodies in stressful situations, especially when they believe they may have been exposed to danger. However, some of the symptoms experienced by the staff seemed too serious and too long-lasting to be explained by stress alone. Several people required medical treatment. Julie Gorky spent time in intensive care and later reported continuing health problems after the incident. It is difficult for many people to believe that such severe symptoms could have been caused only by fear. The mystery also remains because of the strange details that still have no clear explanation. Witnesses described an unusual smell in the room. Several people reported seeing yellow particles in Gloria's blood sample. The pattern of illness seemed to affect the people closest to her more strongly than those farther away. These details continue to suggest that something real happened inside the emergency room, even if no one knows exactly what it was. For Gloria Ramirez's family, the case remains painful for another reason. They have always believed that Gloria became more famous for the mystery surrounding her death than for the life she lived. To the world, she became the toxic lady, but to her family, she was a daughter, a mother, and a woman who had been fighting a serious illness. The mysteries surrounding her death may never be fully solved because too much time has passed. The hospital room was cleaned. The evidence disappeared. The people involved remember the night differently, and some of the details have changed over time. What remains now is a story suspended between science and uncertainty. On one side is the possibility that a rare and unusual chemical reaction took place. On the other is the possibility that fear, confusion, and the power of suggestion changed the way people experienced that night. Neither explanation feels complete, and perhaps that is why the story continues to endure. There are some mysteries that remain with us, not because they are impossible to solve, but because every answer seems to leave something behind. The strange death of Gloria Ramirez is one of those mysteries. Even now, long after the emergency room has grown quiet and the people involved have gone home, the question remains the same. What really happened that night in Riverside? As tonight's story comes to an end, the halls of Riverside General Hospital have long since fallen quiet. The emergency room, where so much confusion and fear unfolded, is simply another room again, filled with different voices, different patients, and different nights. Yet the events of February 19th, 1994 continue to linger. The story of Gloria Ramirez is unusual because it sits between two very different worlds. On one side is medicine, chemistry, and the search for scientific answers. On the other is uncertainty, where memory, fear, and unanswered questions begin to shape the story in different ways. Perhaps there was a rare chemical reaction that no one had ever seen before. Perhaps the fear and confusion of that night changed how people experienced what was happening around them. Or perhaps the truth lies somewhere quietly between those two possibilities. What makes the mystery so lasting is not only that no one fully agrees on what happened, it is also the simple fact that so many ordinary people experience something they could not explain. Doctors and nurses are trained to remain calm in difficult situations. They spend their lives working in emergency rooms, seeing events that most people never witness. Yet, on that night, even they were left frightened and uncertain. For Gloria's family, however, the mystery has always been something more personal. Behind every newspaper headline and every strange theory was a woman who had been very ill and who had come to the hospital hoping to be helped. It is easy, over time, for mysteries to become stories, and for stories to become legends. But Gloria Ramirez was not a legend. She was a real person. Perhaps that is the quiet lesson that remains at the center of this story. Even when a mystery cannot be solved, the people within it should never be forgotten. Now, as the night becomes still and the thoughts of the day begin to fade, there is no need to search any further for answers. You can simply leave the story where it belongs. In a hospital room in Riverside, beneath the bright lights of an ordinary evening, where something happened that no one has ever fully understood. Thank you for spending this quiet time here tonight. If you enjoyed this calm documentary, please remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more true crime, strange history, and unexplained mysteries told in a gentle and sleep-friendly way. And now, as the room around you grows quieter and the night drifts softly onward, you can let the mystery slowly fade into the distance. Good night.